Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I'm still waiting for my mind and my spirit to find their way back to my body, the Domestic Violence and Mental Health Connection, a collaboration between the National Black Catholic Congress and the Catholic Apostolate Center. I'm Alex Cranston, the production coordinator at the Catholic Apostolate Center, and I'll be your host this afternoon as we welcome our speaker, Dr. Tricia Bent-Goodley, a professor of social work at Howard University. We're pleased to have her speaking with us about the important topics of domestic violence and mental health. If you have any technical issues during the presentation, please send me a message in the chat box on the bottom right of your screen, and I'll be sure to help you out. In addition, during the last 15 minutes of the presentation, Dr. Bent-Goodley will be taking questions from you, the audience, so please send them in the Q&A box, again, in the bottom right of your screen. Without further ado, Dr. Tricia Bent-Goodley.
Hello, and thank you so much. I'm so happy to be able to be here today to join you as we talk about what I think is a really important topic. As you can see, the title for the presentation, I'm still waiting for my mind and my spirit to find their way back to my body. That title actually came from a woman who was experiencing domestic violence. And she shared that the most difficult, the most challenging part of having experienced the psychological forms of abuse that she endured was that she was literally waiting for her spirit and for her mind to come back and be with her in her body. And I just thought that was such a profound way of talking about the mental health implications of domestic violence. So we're going to do a few things for the next hour together. I want to talk a little bit about what domestic violence is. I want you to know what types and forms compose domestic violence so you have greater awareness of what it looks like. Then we'll talk about the connection to mental health. And then finally, we'll end with what we can do as a Catholic community to respond to domestic violence. So, what is domestic violence? Domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behaviors and tactics used to inflict power and control over another person. And what makes that so important for us to remember is that domestic violence is a choice. It's a choice that one person makes to perpetrate violence to control another person. It's not accidental. It doesn't occur because of mental health reasons. It doesn't occur because of addiction issues. It doesn't occur because someone is just so upset that they can't control themselves. No, domestic violence is a choice. And it's when one person is using abusive behaviors or tactics to inflict power and control over another person. This issue is very prevalent in our country. No matter where you are, it's important to know that domestic violence is present and it does exist. Each day, nearly 24 people per minute experience rape, physical abuse, or stalking by an intimate partner in the United States. That comes out to being around 12 million men and women per year. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men report experiencing physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And between 4 to 5 survivors of intimate partner violence are women. Each day, there are more than 20,000 calls placed to domestic violence hotlines nationwide. That's 14 calls per minute. And in one day, over 72,000 victims were served, provided services in a domestic violence agency at some place across this country, with nearly 12,000 of those requests being unmet. Almost 7,500 of those requests were for emergency housing. So that tells you that the need is great. Nearly 1.5 million high school students experience violence in an intimate relationship. We know that 1 in 3 adolescents have experienced violence from a dating partner, and that girls between the ages of 16 to 24 or at the greatest risk of experiencing some of our highest rates of intimate partner violence. So indeed, this issue touches all of us. There's no community that is immune from the effects of domestic violence. We know that this is an issue that touches us no matter how much money we make, no matter what kind of job we have, no matter how much education we've attained, and even regardless of our religion or our spiritual beliefs. So it's so important for us to understand that domestic violence occurs and that we have a role that we can play. I wanted to also talk a little bit about how domestic violence impacts the Black community in particular, because I think that that's very important for us to be able to understand. And so I do want to first say that there is great diversity within the Black community. The Black community is not a monolithic community. So you may have persons who identify as African American. It may be a person who is from a Caribbean country, someone who may be Afro-Latino, or someone who might be from a country on the continent of Africa. It's important for us to understand that because how we respond to domestic violence must be linked to the specific needs and nuances of the communities that we are serving. Here's some things that we do know about how African American women experience domestic violence here in this country. African American women experience victimization at a rate 35% higher than white women and 22% higher than that of other women of color. And while 28% of U.S. women experience rape, physical violence, and stalking by an intimate partner, 44% of African American women experience these same forms of violence. In 2015, Black women were murdered at a rate 2 times higher than white females as it relates to intimate partner violence. And then, while Black women make up 13% of the U.S. population, they represent 29% of domestic violence-related fatalities. We know that these issues, these challenges that we see in the Black community are very much linked to barriers that members of the community face in accessing resources. And so it's really important for us to understand that it's not that there's something inherently wrong with the Black community as it relates to this issue, but that each of us has a role to play in dismantling those barriers and creating greater opportunities to be able to get support and to seek change. So let's talk a little bit about what domestic violence looks like. Here I'll talk a bit about the different types of domestic violence. Some people refer to these areas as strategies even. It's important for us to understand this so we understand what domestic violence can look like. We are most familiar oftentimes with physical abuse. Physical abuse can include things like hitting, punching, slapping, burning, shooting, strangling. These are all forms of physical abuse. We might see bruises, broken bones, unexplained injuries. These might be some of the things that we would see for someone who may be experiencing physical violence. In terms of sexual violence, this is a type of abuse that would include things like forcing someone to have sex against their will, forcing someone to have sex with another person or other people that they don't want to have sex with, forcing someone to engage in sex in a way that they are not comfortable with, in a way that they've not consented to. These are some of the forms of sexual violence that a perpetrator of abuse may use as part of controlling that person. Another type of domestic violence is economic abuse. And economic abuse may occur when someone doesn't allow someone to retain the income that they generate. So taking someone's check away from them, giving them an allowance and not allowing them to use those funds. It could also include not allowing someone to work or to continue to be employed, so disrupting their work environment, not allowing them to keep jobs. It could also include, if the person is a student, not allowing that person to be able to get to class or to access the resources that they need to be successful academically. These are some examples of what economic abuse could look like. Psychological abuse includes many different dimensions. And over the many years that I have engaged in working around this issue, I can tell you that many survivors tell me that when the physical abuse healed, it was the psychological abuse that stayed with them. It stayed with them even in new relationships long after the abuse ended. So we want to pay particular attention to psychological abuse. Some of the ways that you might see psychological abuse is when a person may isolate someone from others. Isolation is a key form of abuse. And you may ask why. Well, when a person has isolated someone from their friends, from their family, from other resources, it allows that perpetrator to really inflict abuse in different ways without the survivor having the resources or the person that they can go to access for help. It allows the violence really to occur in silence. And so it's really important if you see or have friends or family members who all of a sudden are very isolated, who are no longer coming around and are missing events that they at one time used to love to come to. These are some things that might become important in terms of looking at this as a form of potentially isolation that could be occurring. Another really important aspect of psychological abuse is the use of verbal abuse. Verbal abuse can be things like belittling someone, telling someone that they're not worthy of anyone else, that no one would want them, calling them out of their name, saying things that are harmful and hurtful, and saying it so much and so often, coupled with isolation, that that survivor begins to believe some of these negative, hurtful, harmful images and messages around their personhood. So verbal abuse can be extraordinarily powerful as a tool of psychological violence. Another form of psychological abuse includes the use of threats. Now, those threats could include punching a hole in a wall. By punching the hole in the wall, the perpetrator is basically saying to that survivor, look at what I could do to you. Another threat could be to threaten the very life of that survivor, telling them that they will kill them if they leave, or kill them if they tell someone. Threatening animals. One of the things that we see is this linkage between animal abuse and domestic violence, where perpetrators will harm animals, cats, dogs, even going as far as to kill them as a way to control that person. Other threats might be to threaten to hurt the children, or to even threaten to call child services and say that the children are being abused or neglected so that the children could be removed from the home. Yes, this indeed is a very serious threat that oftentimes keeps survivors in relationships, even if they want to leave. Another threat is the threat to harm themselves. This is where we'll see a perpetrator who will say, if you leave me, I'm going to kill myself. And so the survivor, not wanting to have that happen, thinking in some way that they can control this, choose to stay. These are different types of threats. They all fall under the guise of psychological abuse. And it's used as a tool to keep a person in a relationship. I want to mention one other form of psychological abuse, and that is controlling behaviors. So someone who might be excessively jealous and say you're not allowed to talk to a family member or a friend, or you're not allowed to talk to someone of the opposite sex, or you're not allowed to wear certain clothes, go to certain places, leave the house at certain times, or access your computer. It's important for us to understand the nature of this type of controlling behavior. You know, some young people have heard that when a person is jealous, they care about you. And so they think that love and jealousy should connect with each other. One thing we know is that a healthy relationship does not, in fact, include someone who has excessive jealousy and jealous behaviors and jealous reactions that include controlling behaviors. So it's important for us to understand that this type of controlling action is a part of psychological abuse. Now, some of you have noticed this puzzle piece, and I often get asked the question, why is spiritual abuse not included as part of the puzzle? Well, I'll say this. One of the things that we've learned is that many times survivors don't just say, I'm experiencing domestic violence. So we end up having to put the puzzle together, and that's what those pieces of the puzzle represent. But spiritual abuse, well, it's not connected because oftentimes people just don't talk about it. They think somehow that the mind and the spirit are the same. As a Catholic community, we know that is indeed not true. Our minds and our spirits are very different. And so I include this part of the puzzle because I think it is different and unique from the other forms of violence. So what is spiritual abuse? What does that look like then? Spiritual abuse could look like not allowing someone to go to their church to worship. It could look like not allowing someone to go to confession. It could look like not allowing someone to be able to meet with the priest or be involved in activities in the church. Spiritual abuse could even look like taking someone's cross, taking their rosary, their Bible, and destroying it, or not allowing a person to have any of those spiritual items in their home. It could even look like telling a person as they beat them, as they abuse them, if God wants to save you, and if he's so powerful, let him stop me now. These are all important forms of spiritual abuse, and they're important for us to understand because they could even happen in our midst. We've had survivors who've talked to us about experiencing stalking in church, where the perpetrator is present and there, and they are actually stalking them during the Mass. We may not know that as we sit in the Mass that day in worship, but that very much could be going on. That terror could actually be experienced. And so it's important for us to have greater awareness and knowledge of this issue and the types of abuse. So some of you may be wondering, well, how does this then impact survivors? How does it impact their families? What can I do? Well, here's some additional information about this domestic violence and mental health connection. And I know that there's a lot of numbers here, but I thought it was important to really give you all a sense of how pervasive this issue is and how domestic violence and mental health connect. This slide talks a little bit about areas of depression that we see, alcohol dependence, and suicidal ideation. 35 to 70% of women in one study who had experienced domestic violence reported signs of depression. And that's compared to 12% of women in the general population who have not experienced abuse. We also saw this greater impact among women who are alcohol dependent. In another study where almost 14% of the women who experienced domestic violence reported being alcohol dependent compared to women in the general population of 1.4%. So we see that this experience of domestic violence disproportionately impacts the experience of depression and alcohol dependency. 42% of women in another study who experienced domestic violence reported having feelings of suicidal ideation. So domestic violence certainly has an impact on the mental health of women. So what could this look like? This is important for us because while those numbers may not necessarily mean as much to us, we may see signs of a person who is in fact depressed. And so it's important for us to just have an idea of what it could in fact look like. So some of the signs that you see here: a person who may feel sadness, confusion. They might actually seem to have a really bad temper or be irritable in some ways. They may have difficulty concentrating. They may feel hopeless. Someone might actually feel fatigued, while another person may feel a bit restless. Some people may isolate themselves, and some people may eat more, and others eat less. So it's important for us to see there are different ways that someone might show that they are in fact depressed. And so it's important as we see these signs and see these behaviors among friends or family or even members of our church to just pay closer attention. Now, there's some other mental health consequences. And in this part of the slide, we're going to look a little bit around anxiety disorder and PTSD. We know in one study, more than half of the women who experienced domestic violence reported signs of anxiety disorder, and more than half of survivors. And this number is really interesting because you're talking about between 50 to nearly 3/4 of the women in the study reported signs of experiencing PTSD. That's compared to 10% of women in the general population. So clearly, domestic violence really does impact the mental health of a survivor. What could this look like? What might you see? So for a person who might be experiencing anxiety, this person might experience fatigue. They could have difficulty concentrating. They may tell you that their thoughts are racing. They're really worried. They might even tell you that they're having heart palpitations. Now, this is important because we find that sometimes women are admitted into emergency rooms believing that they're having a heart attack when, in fact, they could be having an anxiety attack. So heart palpitations are a really important sign for us of someone who is experiencing a high level of anxiety. They could be trembling or feel a great deal of restlessness. Now, for someone who's experiencing PTSD, we may see some of these similar signs, but other things that we may see, the person may describe having flashbacks of a moment, or maybe flashbacks of something that the person was wearing, like a cologne or a perfume. They may have really intruding thoughts. Maybe they're at work or school, and all of a sudden they begin to think about something that happened to them. Those intruding thoughts that they just can't get out of their minds. They may experience emotional numbness. They may tell you they don't even know how to feel. They're having a hard time feeling. The person might have a heightened startling position where they might get a heightened startle response. And We also find that persons with PTSD could have difficulty sleeping. So these are all behaviors we can be aware of in terms of what we could see if someone is experiencing anxiety or PTSD. I think it's important to talk about traumatic brain injury and domestic violence for a few reasons. One, we know that traumatic brain injury can occur as a result of physical abuse, and it can have consequences that impact mental health. It's also important because many survivors do not seek help for this. They may have been strangled. They may have had a physical injury to the head. Maybe they could have been hit in the head. They could have been pushed into a wall. They could have fell and hit their head. And sometimes they won't go to the hospital to see if there's anything that occurred from that. As you can see here, between 40 and 92% of survivors in a recent study suffered a physical injury to the head, and nearly half of them, reported experiencing strangulation. So this is important for us. We want to make sure that if a person experienced a traumatic brain injury, that they are in fact getting the help and the support that they may need. So here are some ways that this could look. These are some ways that it could look for us. You might see a person who has a continuous headache or a migraine, as they might describe it. If they lost consciousness, certainly we want to make sure that they're getting access to medical care. They could be confused, feel dizzy, have slurred speech, feel really nauseous, or could be vomiting. They might have sleep loss or may have some type of nerve injury. These are potential signs of a TBI. We also might see someone who's experienced memory loss. They may have difficulty concentrating, may feel confused, sometimes irritable. And yes, we definitely see the connection with depression and anxiety. These are some of the signs of what a traumatic brain injury could look like. And while it's important for us to understand what that survivor could be experiencing, we also know the importance of how this could impact children in the home who might be witnessing this violence and who are trying to wrestle with it and understand it themselves. So we thought it was important for you to just get a little bit more information around children's exposure to domestic violence and what that could look like. I know as a mother who has children in Catholic schools, and as a product of growing up in the Catholic school, we touch so many lives. As someone who's taught CCD, that it's important for us to make sure that we understand what could be occurring in the lives of the children that we're coming into contact in our communities. So what we know is anywhere between 3.3 and 10 million children witness domestic violence each year. I know that's a huge number. It's something that we're learning more about, that we continue to learn more about. It's estimated that 30 million children will have witnessed domestic violence before they turn 17. That's a lot of children. And in a snapshot of looking at persons who are receiving services for domestic violence in the DV census, there were 25,022 children who were being served by a domestic violence service provider. That is in one day. And almost 13,000 of those children were receiving care in an emergency shelter. Think about that. So it's really important for us as the Catholic community to be engaged in thinking about this as it relates to our children. So what could we see? If you are working with children in CCD or in a Catholic school, what could that potentially look like? This could be a child that has trouble sleeping, that's wetting the bed, that might have outbursts, really aggressive behavior. But we also have children who might try to be a perfectionist. They're afraid to fail. because they're trying desperately to keep the peace in their home. You could have a child who has developed an eating disorder, who might actually be experiencing headaches. You could have a child who's also having stomach aches. These are some of the ways that trauma and that pain begins to enter into the body. We can have children who are missing school, who are hurting themselves, who are all of a sudden either having really poor peer and sibling relationships or beginning to hang out with a new group of players in their school who may not necessarily be invested in their best interest. We could also have young people who have a really hard time growing their attachments with adults and other children. And there are other long-term health and mental health implications. So these are things that we can see, that we can look for as we are engaging and working with the young people under our influence. We as a church community have a role to play. It's important for us. A few years ago, I conducted a study among Black churches of many different denominations to talk about and ask them, how should Black churches respond to domestic violence? What are some of the barriers? What are some of our strengths? What is it that we as a faith-based community can offer in responding to these issues? And these are two quotes from participants that I thought were really important. One person said, "Too bad our ministers were not here, because they're really the place where policies start and they counsel victims. I also know that a number of belief changes need to be made, such as keeping families together at all costs, victims being forgiving, and wives being submissive. These things are going to be difficult to change and will require a lot of time. Sometimes it takes a generation for old ideas to die." Another quote, "Spirituality does impact the way a person copes with domestic violence. Most professionals don't know about this, or they just aren't willing to deal with it. And that's why people come to their minister, because they know that we are going to deal with the most important part of who they are. We are going to deal with the spirit and not just the circumstance." We all have a role to play in responding to domestic violence. We all have a role, whether we are in a leadership position, whether you are a priest, or whether you are a lay person. Whoever you are in your community, your church community, there's a role to play. So what can we do as people of faith? Well, the first thing I would tell you is don't judge the person. Don't judge this person. Judgment often leads to a person feeling silenced and even more isolated. As part of not judging, I would also encourage you to not justify the abuse either. Sometimes we hear people who will say, "Well, maybe you shouldn't have made the person upset," or "What could you have done differently?" Remember, the use of violence in an intimate relationship is intentional. The survivor doesn't control when it happens or how it happens or if it will happen. So it's important for us not to judge and not to excuse poor behavior. We, as people of faith, can refer survivors to resources in the community. We can learn more. So I talked a little bit about some of the signs today, but certainly you can grow in your knowledge of what the signs are and what the red flags are. You can adopt a shelter in your local community and share your gifts. We can also learn how to use Scripture to help. Sometimes we find that people will take a part of a scripture and use it to suggest that a person should stay in an abusive relationship. It's important for us to be reminded of the great power of Scripture, its holiness, and how it is used to help to fill us up to be able to negotiate all the things that we do in our lives. Don't just tell people to leave a relationship. This is important. Leaving a relationship can be one of the most dangerous periods for a survivor. So encouraging them to get support if they choose to leave is really important. connecting them with a provider. And if you're interested, you can, if they want you to come, even go sit and just be present. Hold their hand. Just be there. That's a way that we as a person of faith can just be supportive. And if we're in healthy relationships ourselves, be a model for others. Talk about the nature of that healthy relationship so people know that it does indeed exist and they are worthy of it. As a church, what can we do? Our churches can create protocols on how to respond to domestic violence. For example, making sure that we do not offer couples counseling to persons who are in abusive relationships. It literally can result in the hurt and harm of that survivor. So having churches create protocols, getting help from local providers in doing it, will be a great way for the church to proactively respond to domestic violence. Creating domestic violence initiatives, or even a ministry. I tell churches that if you decide to create a ministry, a domestic violence ministry, there's so much involved in that, so much work that needs to happen. So take baby steps so that you're able to really sustain the approaches you want to use. Including domestic violence providers at church functions. So if your church is having a health fair, bring domestic violence providers there, or a woman's day, or a men's day. Bring the providers there to provide and share information. You can also provide domestic violence resources like pamphlets from your local community in your pews, or provide some information in the bulletin. You can adopt a shelter in your local community and meet with local domestic violence providers to learn more. It's so important for those who are in leadership in churches to learn more about this issue. And the priest can conduct a homily on the importance of healthy and violence-free relationships. Just hearing that coming from our priest is so critical and so important. And then finally, what can we do for our children? For those who are connected to Catholic schools, who are teaching CCD, who are connected to our young people in youth ministry, there's a role that we can play. CCD classes could include information on what does it mean to be in a healthy relationship. Now, I understand we have to be age and developmentally appropriate, but it can start as early with just talking about how we treat each other in a Catholic community, what it means to be a really good and honorable and helping person to someone else. That's talking about a healthy relationship. Catholic high schools can connect with providers in the community who can come in and provide information about dating and domestic violence prevention. For school counselors and for teachers, they can even help schools develop their own protocols on how to respond when dating violence occurs in their school. We can also educate teachers on the signs of dating and domestic violence or children who could be witnessing violence and come up with a way that they can be connected to persons within the school so that they can get more help for those families. And then finally, we can teach young people the signs of healthy relationships and unhealthy relationships. I can't tell you how often I'll talk with not just young people, but others about this issue. And they'll say, I don't even know what a healthy relationship looks like. We can do something about that. As I get ready to answer your questions, I want to just share some resources with you. These are resources that you can use and access online, and they provide an opportunity for you to get more information about some of what I talked about today, as well as what the Catholic Church has said regarding domestic violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bent-Goodley. It was a wonderful presentation. We're really happy to have you here, and we have a lot of questions from people who are very interested in what you have to say. And I want to start out with one question that said, one person asked that you stated that young women between the ages of 16 to 24 are at greatest risk of intimate partner violence. Their daughter is in that age range, and what should they be saying to her to keep her from entering into an abusive relationship?
Thanks for that question. one of the things I think that we can do is talk with our children about signs of healthy and unhealthy relationships. So if you think that it's occurring, this might be a great opportunity to sometimes offer a workshop in their school, offer a workshop at church, just to have someone come in and provide some information to get the dialogue going, or going to them and talking with them about the relationship they're in and how are they experiencing it. This is an opportunity for us to talk with our children. For those who may have younger children, we know dating violence actually is starting at an even younger age in middle schools. So consider talking as an opportunity to kind of preempt some of this. Talk with young people even earlier about what it means to be in an unhealthy and healthy relationship, and keep the doors open so that they're open to being able to talk with you.
Thank you so much for that. Another question is forms of parental abuse, particularly psychological abuse that might stem from mental health disorders like a narcissistic personality disorder. How can children in these situations be helped when there are few identifiers of this abuse?
So we may see some of those very similar signs that I mentioned earlier in terms of behaviors or some of the cognitive functioning. So we might see, again, a young person who's experiencing depression or anxiety in those situations. And again, I want to encourage you to connect with providers in your community. I think sometimes we try to go it alone. It's important for us, though, to connect that to mental health providers who are in your local community. What's neat about the resources that I've provided to you is that no matter where you are in the country, if you contact these resources, particularly the National Domestic Violence Hotline, they actually will connect you to a local provider in your community who can talk with you further. But I encourage you to get help early, and include mental health clinicians as part of that strategy.
Wonderful. I think it's really important for us to know that there are resources out there that we can connect with that help us then connect with other people.
Yes.
So then we're not in this alone. We're all in this together.
That's right.
Is there something that lay people can do on a parish level besides, you said, hosting those different sessions that we can have, having a pastor give a homily on the topic? Is there something that you have experienced lay people doing at the parish level that really inspired you in your community and that worked well for the domestic violence survivors or preventing domestic violence from happening? Is there something that you've experienced either in your own community or somewhere else?
One of the things that I have experienced that was really helpful for me was Bible study. And Bible study with the intention of really being able to talk about how God loves us, how we can be empowered through the truth of the Bible. And I really had an opportunity to learn more about myself, about people around me, and also about what Holy Scripture tells us. And so I think in our communities, if we really think creatively just about creating a space where people can really better understand the Holy Word and build connections with others. It gave me an opportunity to connect with people in my church that honestly I see every Sunday, but don't necessarily always talk to. And so now it's given us an even greater relationship and even a greater opportunity. So while that group was not necessarily focused on domestic violence only, it created opportunities to really grow my resources, build new relationships, learn more about myself, and learn more about God and build my relationship with God. So I think sometimes we think we have to do a program that's just on domestic violence, and we really don't. Sometimes we have to create more opportunities to build relationships.
I think you made an excellent point about community, and community is such an essential part to not only our faith, but to building good relationships, and I think that's really important.
Yeah.
We have a few more minutes for questions, so if anyone has any more questions, please feel free to send them in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. But we do have a few more that have already been sent in, and one of them, which I think is really important, is what are some things that I should definitely not do if someone when I know when it comes to helping a victim of domestic abuse, whether they've come to me or I suspect it, what should I not do?
Mm-hmm. So a few things that I would say in terms of what not to do. So again, please don't judge the person. And sometimes we do that really innocently. We may say something like, that would never happen to me, or I would never put up with that. And what that conveys is judgment. So you don't want to judge the person. I think the other thing you don't want to do is if they come to you and say they've experienced this, don't ignore it. Don't act like it didn't happen or that it's not a big deal. Provide them even with the support of saying, wow, I'm really not sure what else to tell you to do, but I know that's hard and none of us should experience abuse. And there are resources here in the community that can really help you with that, even though I may not know exactly what to do. That's a great way to respond. The other thing, as I mentioned, please don't just say to the person, just leave, just get out of the relationship, because it really takes good support in helping a person navigate the process of leaving the relationship as safe as they possibly can. And the other thing I would say to you is I always encourage people, if someone is experiencing domestic violence, if there's a situation that's happening right in front of you, sometimes people will say to me, what do I do? Do I just rush in? Do I stop it? Or if I know that abuse is going on, do I go in and put myself in harm's way? I will say to you, no, you should never, ever put yourself in harm's way. I think that's really important for us. We can be supportive without hurting ourselves at the same time. So you may need to call the police, maybe make a distraction, but, I wouldn't ever suggest to someone that they put themselves at risk. Those are things that we should never do.
Wonderful, thank you. And someone someone said that they want their pastor to address these issues of domestic violence, of abuse, of mental health, but they don't know how to ask their pastor to do that. Do you have any recommendations for how one might go about talking to their pastor about issues that they see in their own community, particularly mental health and domestic violence?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's important sometimes for us to, one, share our experience, share either what you're seeing, share what your own experience may be with your pastor, so that they are encouraged to know this is happening. I think sometimes pastors don't necessarily feel like it's happening in their church. And so I gave you some numbers earlier around prevalence. We definitely know that it's happening. And so being able to say, here's my experience, here's the experience of a different person or others in the church, and really asking, how do we respond to that? I'll say this, the pastor may not exactly know what to do, and that's where, again, you being able to bring in or connect someone from the domestic violence or the mental health community to come in, maybe during a parish council meeting, to have a conversation around providing education. I'll say, in doing some work in different communities, we were talking with providers who could actually tell us local churches where they were getting domestic violence survivors coming from. So people in the provider community knew that local church based on the survivors who were coming there to get help, and that pastor knew nothing about it. So it's a missed opportunity to minister to people who need it the most. So being able to explain it that way, I think, is also really helpful. Making that connection to other resources, I think, helps that pastor to be more informed and have some resources so that he can then use that and access that and leverage that within the church.
Wonderful, thank you. I think having those resources will be very helpful for parishes, for pastors, for members of pastoral councils, and so on and so forth. Well, I think that concludes our webinar today. Thank you so much, Dr. Tricia Bent-Goodley, for all of your wonderful insight and resources. This is certainly has been a wonderful, has opened my eyes to the horror that's going on, but to the wonderful resources that we have that we can assist those in our local community.
Yes.
We'll have a recording of this webinar uploaded to the CatholicApostleCenter.org and NBCCongress.org. That way, we'll have it in the next week for those who wish to rewatch the webinar, or for those who were unable to make it this time. You're welcome to share it with anyone you'd like. As always, all of our content is free to share. If you haven't yet found the Catholic Apostolate Center or the National Black Catholic Congress on social media, please like or follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram in the hope that we'll continue to reach more people with spreading the message of the gospel. In the words of St. Vincent Pallotti, may the charity of Christ urge you on. Thank you, and God bless.